I'd been at the department for 28 years when I finally submitted my retirement papers. 28 years of showing up at 7 in the morning, of drinking coffee from the same chipped mug, of watching younger, less qualified people get promoted above me while I stayed at the same desk, the same title, the same salary. 28 years of being the punchline to a joke I'd stopped finding funny a long time ago. I walked into Director Miller's office and placed the form on his desk. He didn't look up from his computer. He didn't pause his phone call. He just waved his hand in my general direction and muttered the two words that ended my career. Approved. Get it processed. That was it. 28 years, gone in a breath. No thank you. No farewell. No acknowledgement that I'd been the one holding this department together for nearly 3 decades. I went back to my cubicle, packed my things into a cardboard box, and walked out the door. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 7:30. I let it ring. I was retired now. Retired meant I didn't have to answer calls from people who'd spent 28 years pretending I didn't exist. By 9 o'clock, there were 17 missed calls. By 10, there were 32. I made myself another cup of coffee and watched the phone vibrate across my kitchen counter. The screen lit up with names I hadn't seen in years. Director Miller, Deputy Director Chin, the head of legal, the head of finance, the head of just about every department I'd spent my career supporting. They were panicking. I knew why. The audit was scheduled for next week, and without me, no one knew where to find the documents. No one remembered the policies from 2008, the regulations from 2015, the secret amendments that had never been formally recorded but had been applied to every major decision for the past decade. No one had any idea that the entire department's operational history existed only in my head and in the handwritten notebooks I'd kept in my bottom drawer. I tried to tell them. I tried to document everything. I'd submitted reports, created spreadsheets, offered to train the younger staff. No one had been interested. I was just the old clerk, the one who'd been there too long, the one who should have retired years ago. The first person to show up at my door was Deputy Director Chin. He was sweating, his tie askew, his eyes wild. He didn't even wait for me to open the door properly before he started talking. Mr. Lee, we need you. The audit team is here tomorrow, and we can't find the 2019 compliance waiver. The one that exempted the department from the third-party review requirement for projects under 50 million, I said calmly. You need to look in the gray filing cabinet, third drawer from the bottom. The file is labeled Special Exemptions 2019, but it's filed under Miscellaneous. It's been misfiled since 2021. He stared at me like I just performed a magic trick. How do you know that? Because I filed it there, I said, and no one ever asked me to fix it. The second person to arrive was Director Miller himself. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. The stress of the impending audit had clearly taken its toll. Mr. Lee, he said, his voice carefully neutral, I think we need to talk about bringing you back. Bringing me back? On a consulting basis. We'll pay you, of course. We're offering $5,000 for a full week of work. I laughed. I couldn't help it. $5,000? For a week. We're trying to be generous here. Mr. Miller, I said, do you have any idea how much time I spent over the past 28 years doing work that no one else could do? How many times I saved this department from audit failures, compliance issues, and legal headaches? How many times I stayed late to fix mistakes made by people who were making 3 times my salary? He opened his mouth to respond, but I kept going. You're not offering me a consulting fee. You're offering me pocket change to save your career. The negotiations took 3 hours. I'd learned patience over 28 years. I could wait. They couldn't. Eventually, Miller agreed to my terms. I'd return to the department as a special policy consultant. With an hourly rate of $5,000, I'd work only on the tasks I agreed to. And I'd be addressed as Professor Lee by everyone in the building. The last condition was the one that seemed to hurt him the most. Professor Lee, he repeated, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. Don't worry, I said. You'll get used to it, just like I got used to being called that old clerk for 28 years. I walked into the department at 9 the next morning. Everything looked the same fluorescent lights, the same gray cubicles, the same smell of stale coffee and desperation. But everything had changed. The staff parted to let me through. They nodded respectfully. They called me Professor Lee. They looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Fear. I'd become a weapon, a liability they couldn't control, and they knew it. Miller had arranged a private office for me, the same office I'd been passed over for 28 years ago when they'd given it to some fresh MBA who couldn't even format a proper spreadsheet. I sat down at the desk and looked out the window. The view was nice. I'd never seen it before. The audit started at 11. The lead auditor was a man named Jameson, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, the kind of person who took pleasure in finding mistakes. I'd dealt with him before. He'd always respected my work, even when my superiors didn't. Mr. Lee, he said, shaking my hand, I thought you retired. I did, I said. They called me back. Desperation. Something like that. The audit lasted 3 days. I fielded every question, produced every document, explained every exception. I knew everything about this department, every policy, every loophole, every decision that had been made in the past 28 years. I knew where the bodies were buried, and I knew how to keep them buried. But I also knew where the truth was buried. When they asked about the Green Lake project, I paused. That project had been a disaster. The deputy director at the time had been pushing hard for it, ignored every warning sign, and nearly got the department sued. The only reason it hadn't blown up was that I'd quietly filed a report that proved the department had followed proper procedure. But I also had the emails, the ones showing the deputy director had known about the risks and pushed forward anyway. You look troubled, Jameson said. Just thinking, I said. I might have some additional materials for you to review. I went home that night and opened the box I'd kept hidden in my closet. Inside were years of records, everything I'd saved, everything I'd documented, everything that proved the department's leaders had been covering their mistakes for decades. I'd never used them before. I'd always believed in loyalty, in doing my job, in keeping my head down. But loyalty goes both ways, and the department had never been loyal to me. The next morning, I handed Jameson a folder. It contained the complete timeline of the Green Lake project, including all the emails I'd kept, the ones that showed exactly who had been responsible, who had known, and who had tried to cover it up. "What is this?" Jameson asked, flipping through the pages. "Evidence," I said. "Of what?" I smiled. "Everything you've been looking for." Deputy Director Chun was escorted out of the building that afternoon. Miller tried to call me, but I let it go to voicemail. His message was a desperate blur of threats and pleas. "You can't do this to us, Lee. We gave you everything. We brought you back. We respected you." I thought about the 28 years I'd spent being ignored, the raises I'd never gotten, the promotions I'd never been given, the nights I'd spent working alone while the leadership went out for expensive dinners. "Respect," I said to the empty room. "You never respected me. You just needed me." The fallout was immediate. Miller was forced to resign. The board called for an emergency meeting. The press picked up the story, and suddenly the whole city was talking about the clerk who'd saved the department for decades and been treated like dirt. I didn't comment on any of it. I'd said what I needed to say. The evidence spoke for itself. A week later, I received a letter from the State Auditor General's office. They'd reviewed the evidence and wanted to commend me for my exceptional commitment to transparency and accountability. They were also recommending an award for my work. I put the letter on my fridge next to the takeout menu. 2 months later, I got a call from a private consulting firm. They'd heard about my work, about my knowledge, about the way I'd single-handedly saved the department from a major scandal. They wanted me to join their team. The salary was 5 times what I'd ever made at the department. I thanked them and said I'd think about it. But I already knew my answer. 28 years of being invisible. And now I was the most visible man in the city. I'd been consulting for 6 weeks when the first real threat came. It wasn't overt, nothing so crude as a death threat or a visit from intimidating men in suits. It was more subtle than that, a quiet campaign of whispers, a sudden loss of client interest, a vague warning from a former colleague who still had connections. "I heard her digging too deep," he said. "People are getting nervous." I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. I wasn't digging. I was just doing my job, providing information that was already out there. But I knew. The Green Lake investigation had opened a door, and the people who'd been exposed were panicking. They'd lost their positions, their reputations, their carefully constructed lives. And they wanted someone to blame. The first attempt came from a law firm representing Deputy Director Chin. They wanted to depose me, said I'd made false accusations, damaged his reputation, caused irreparable harm to a public servant with an exemplary record. I didn't hire a lawyer. I just sent them a copy of the emails I kept, the ones Chin had tried to delete after the audit began, the ones that showed exactly what he'd known and when he'd known it. The deposition never happened. The second attempt came from Director Miller. He'd been quietly reassigned to a desk job in a remote department, but he still had friends in high places. He used those friends to try and discredit me, loose rumors in the press. Anonymous phone calls to my clients suggesting I was unreliable, a whisper campaign designed to chip away at my reputation until no one would hire me. I didn't do anything about it directly. I just got a bigger client. The state government called me in to consult on a project that had been languishing for years. They tried to fix it themselves, but their own experts were stumped. The project involved a tangled web of regulations, exemptions, and special permits that had been issued over decades, and no one could figure out how to untangle them. I solved it in 2 days. The governor's office called me personally to thank me. They offered me a permanent position. I declined politely. The whisper campaign stopped almost immediately. The thing about power is that people only hold it as long as others believe they do. Once my reputation became known, the whispers lost their power. People wanted to work with me, not against me. Clients called from all over the country. I turned most of them down. I was a consultant, not a full-time worker. But I accepted one job that came with a catch. An old friend, or at least the closest thing I had to a friend in the department, called me for help. His name was Mark, a mid-level supervisor who'd always treated me decently, who'd never looked down on me the way others had. He kept his head down for years, done his job, stayed out of trouble. Now his head was on the block. "I don't know who else to call," he said. "The investigation into the department is expanding. They're looking at everyone now, and I think," he paused, "I think I'm going to be the next one they come for." "Mark, I don't work for the department anymore." "I know, but you know the records better than anyone. You know the truth. And the truth is, I was just following orders. I never knew what they were hiding." I met Mark at a cafe across town. He was pale, his hands shaking as he held his coffee. He looked older than I remembered, the strain of the past few months etched into his face. "Tell me what you know," I said. "I don't know anything," he said. "That's the problem. I was just a mid-level guy. I processed the paperwork. I didn't read the files. I didn't question the decisions. I just did what I was told." "Then why would they be coming after you?" "Because I was the one who signed off on the Green Lake file," he said. "I was the second signature, the one that made it official. I didn't know anything about the corruption. I just approved the documents." "Then you need to prove you didn't know." "How?" I thought about it. I thought about the files I'd kept, the ones I'd never shared. I thought about the moments I'd been sitting in my cubicle, watching the corruption happen around me, and doing nothing. I hadn't done nothing. I'd documented it, but I'd never shared the documents. Until now. I went back to my apartment and opened the box I'd kept hidden for years. Inside were files on nearly every major project the department had handled in the past decade. Green Lake was just the beginning. There were others, bigger ones, more complicated ones. And in every case, I'd kept the evidence. I'd always thought of myself as a conscientious objector, someone who was saving the truth in case it was ever needed. But now I realized I'd been doing more than that. I'd been building a case. I met with Mark again, this time with a lawyer present. I gave him copies of the relevant documents, the ones that showed he'd never been in the loop, never been part of the decision-making, never been anything more than a middleman doing his job. This should be enough, I said. But you have to be careful. The people behind this aren't going to stop just because you've got evidence. They're going to try to discredit you. They're going to try to destroy you. Like they did to you, he asked. Like they tried, I said. It didn't work. The investigation continued. Mark was cleared of all wrongdoing, but the damage was already done. His career was over. He'd been tainted by association, and in the bureaucratic world, association was enough. I felt a weight on my chest that I couldn't shake. I'd helped him, but I hadn't saved him. I'd done what I could. And then I got a call from the state attorney general's office. They wanted to talk to me. Not about Mark, not about the department. About something bigger. Mr. Lee, the attorney general said, we've been looking into the broader pattern of corruption in the city government, and we think you might have information that could help us. I'd kept my head down for 28 years. I'd seen things I shouldn't have seen, known things I shouldn't have known, but I'd never spoken out. Now I had a choice. I could stay quiet and let the corruption continue, or I could speak up and risk everything. I thought about 28 years of being ignored. I thought about my father, dying alone because I couldn't take time off work. I thought about the people like Mark, who'd been swept up in something they didn't understand. I made my choice. Tell me what you need. The next few weeks were chaos. I'd never intended to be a whistleblower. I just wanted to do my job and go home. But once I started talking, I couldn't stop. I gave them everything. The files, the notes, the memories of conversations and meetings and quiet moments of corruption that I gave them the truth. And they used it to bring down a network of corruption that stretched to the highest levels of the city government. The mayor resigned. Several key officials were indicted. The city's financial systems were restructured. It was the biggest political scandal in a decade, and I was at the center of it. I didn't want to be in the center of it. I wanted to be left alone. But the reporters, the cameras, the endless questions, they wouldn't leave me alone. Mr. Lee, one journalist asked, why did you wait so long to speak up? I thought about that question for a long time. Because no one ever asked, I said. And because I didn't know if anyone would listen. The reforms that followed were smaller than I'd hoped. The city government was a machine, and machines don't change easily, but there were some differences. New accountability measures, better training for mid-level managers, a system for reporting misconduct that didn't rely on people like me. I was given an award. I was invited to speak at conferences. I was called a hero by some and a traitor by others. I didn't care about any of it. I went back to consulting. I took on fewer clients now, only the ones that interested me. I made more money than I'd ever made at the department. I bought a house, settled into a life that was quiet and peaceful. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that the people I'd helped bring down weren't the only ones, that the corruption I'd exposed was just the surface of a much deeper problem. I was right. A year later, I got a package in the mail. It was from an anonymous source, someone who said they'd worked at the department for years and had seen things they couldn't forget. The package contained documents, photos, and recordings that went far beyond anything I'd uncovered. I read through them, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The corruption wasn't limited to the city government. It went all the way to the state level. It involved people I'd never met, people I'd never suspected. And one of them had been my father. I sat in my living room, staring at the evidence, and I felt the world shift beneath me. My father had been a mid-level bureaucrat in the same system. He'd never gotten ahead, never been promoted. He'd always told me he didn't want the responsibility. Now I knew the truth. He'd been part of it. He'd known about the corruption, and he'd done nothing to stop it. He died with the secret, and I'd inherited it. I thought about the night I'd missed his final hours because of work. I thought about the years I'd spent blaming myself. And I realized that my father had been just like me, a man who'd kept his head down, who'd ignored the corruption around him, who'd chosen silence over action. I'd been his son in more ways than one. I spent the next week trying to decide what to do. I could stay quiet like he had. I could protect his memory, his legacy, the name he'd left me. I could let the past stay buried. Or I could tell the truth. I thought about the people who'd been hurt by the corruption, the ones who'd lost their livelihoods, their homes, their hope. I thought about the future, the next generation of bureaucrats and politicians who'd inherit the system we'd built. I made my choice. I contacted the Attorney General's office and told them I had new evidence. The investigation expanded. The state government was shaken, and my father's name was dragged through the mud. I didn't defend him. I couldn't. He'd made his choices. He'd lived his life, and his legacy was not my burden to protect. But I learned something from the whole thing. I learned that truth is its own reward, that speaking up, even when it's hard, is always the right choice, that the past can't be changed, but the future can. And I learned that 28 years of being invisible had taught me something valuable. It had taught me to see. The anonymous package sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it again. I'd read through the documents once, enough to know my father's name was in them, enough to know he'd been more than just a passive observer, but I hadn't had the courage to go back. Not yet. On the 4th day, I made coffee, sat down at the table, and started reading. My father had been a mid-level administrator in the department's finance division from 1985 to 2002, and I knew that. What I didn't know was that he'd been the one who designed the system that allowed the Green Lake project to slip through without proper oversight. Not the corruption itself. He wasn't the one taking bribes, but he'd created the loophole, the one that let Deputy Director Chin approve projects without full disclosure. the one that had been used for years to funnel money to connected contractors. He hadn't been a criminal. He'd been an enabler. I sat there, staring at the evidence, and I felt something I'd never expected. Relief. Not because he was innocent, he wasn't, but because I finally understood him. I understood the weight he'd carried, the choices he'd made, the reasons he'd never talked about his work. He'd been like me. He'd kept his head down, done his job, and told himself he was just following orders. And he'd carried that guilt to his grave. I called the Attorney General's office the next morning. I have more information, I said, about my father. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Lee, are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything. The investigation expanded again. My father's role was investigated, documented, and added to the case filed. IT wasn't the most damning evidence, but it was enough to show a pattern. A culture of corruption that had been built over decades, with thousands of small choices adding up to something much bigger. And I'd been part of it. Not actively, not knowingly, but I'd been there. I'd seen things, ignored things, kept my mouth shut because it was easier. I told myself I was a victim of the system, but I'd also been part of the system, and I'd have to live with that. A week later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. MR.LI? The voice was female, middle-aged, with a kind of brisk efficiency that came from years of working in bureaucracy. My name is Susan, and I worked with your father at the department. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. I wasn't aware you existed. I'm not surprised. Your father and I kept our relationship quiet. There was a pause. We were partners, not just at work. I met Susan at a cafe across town. She was in her late 60s, neatly dressed, with the kind of watchful eyes that had seemed too much to be surprised by anything. She ordered tea, not coffee, and she didn't touch it while she talked. Your father and I worked together for 17 years, she said. We were close, very close. And when I heard about the investigation, I knew I had to come forward. Come forward with what? She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. This. The folder contained records that hadn't been included in the official files. Letters, memos, notes written in my father's handwriting. They showed a side of him I'd never known. The notes were detailed, almost confessional. He'd documented everything. The decisions he'd questioned, the orders he'd followed, the times he'd wanted to speak up and stayed silent. He'd been building a case too, not against anyone else, against himself. Your father was a good man, Susan said. He made mistakes, but he knew what he was doing was wrong, and he wanted to make it right. Why didn't he? I asked. Why didn't he come forward? Because he was afraid. She met my eyes. He was afraid of losing his job, his reputation, his family. He was afraid of what it would do to you, and he was afraid that no one would believe him. I took the folder home and read through it that night. The documents painted a picture of a man who'd been trapped in a system he couldn't escape. A man who'd made compromises he hated, who'd hoped every day for a chance to be better, and who died before that chance came. I'd always thought my father was a weak man. I blamed him for not fighting harder, for not protecting me, for not being the kind of father I needed. But now I understood. He'd been fighting his own battle, and he'd lost. I went to my father's grave the next day. I'd never been good at visiting. It always felt too final, too real. But this time, I sat down on the grass and talked to him for an hour. I found the records, I said. I know what you did. I know why you did it. And I want you to know that I understand. The wind blew through the trees, scattering leaves across the gravestone. I'm not forgiving you, I said, but I'm not blaming you either. I'm just glad I finally know the truth. The investigation continued without me. I'd given them everything I had. The rest was in the hands of people who knew how to use it. I stepped back from the spotlight, went back to my consulting, and tried to rebuild a life that had been shaken to its core. But the past had a way of catching up with me. 6 months after the investigation ended, I received a letter from the State Ethics Commission. They'd reviewed all the evidence, including my father's notes. And they'd issued a formal finding that the department's culture of corruption had been enabled by years of systemic failures that my father had identified and tried to document. The letter was addressed to me, but it was really addressed to him. It was a posthumous acknowledgement that he'd tried, that he'd done what he could, that the fault wasn't his alone. I read the letter 3 times, and then I put it on my fridge next to the takeout menu and the award from the city. A few weeks later, I got a call from Mark. He'd been offered a job in a different department, one with better oversight, better ethics, better systems. He was rebuilding his life one day at a time. I just wanted to thank you, he said, for everything you did, for saving my career, for saving my life. I didn't save your life, I said. Maybe not, but you gave me a second chance, and that's more than I ever expected. I thought about Mark, about my father, about the 28 years I'd spent at the department. I thought about all the people who'd been hurt by the system and all the people who'd tried to fix it from the inside. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a victim. I was just a man who'd finally learned to tell the truth. And sometimes that was enough. But the truth had one more surprise for me. The final twist came from Susan, my father's old partner. She called me a year after we'd met, her voice urgent. I found something else, she said. Something your father never told anyone. I think you need to see it. She came to my apartment the next day, carrying a small box. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, written over the course of decades. They were addressed to me, all of them, and they'd never been sent. He wrote them every year, Susan said. Every birthday, every holiday, every time he thought about something he wished he'd told you. He never had the courage to send them, but he wanted you to know. I opened the first letter, dated the year I'd started at the department. Dear son, it began. I know I don't say this enough, but I'm proud of you. I read through the letters that night, one by one. He'd written about his fears, his regrets, his hopes for me. He'd written about the corruption he'd seen, the guilt he'd carried, the wish that he'd been a better man. He'd written about his love for me, a love he'd never been able to express in person. And the last letter, dated the week before he died. I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you deserved. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from the world. But I want you to know that you're the best thing I ever did, and I'm grateful for every minute we had. I sat in my living room, surrounded by letters I'd never received, and I felt something I'd never felt before. Peace. I'd spent my whole life trying to be the opposite of my father, trying to be stronger, braver, more honest. But now I realized that the line between us wasn't as clear as I'd thought. We were both men who'd been shaped by the same system. We'd both made compromises, ignored things we should have seen, stayed silent when we should have spoken up. But we both tried, and in the end, trying was all anyone could do. I went back to my consulting work, but things had changed. I was less interested in the money now, more interested in the mission that I started taking on clients who couldn't afford my normal rates. I started teaching, mentoring, sharing the knowledge I'd accumulated over decades. I started being the person my father had wanted to be, and I started to let go of the anger. I still think about him sometimes, the father I'd resented for so many years, the man I blamed for my failures, my frustrations, my inability to move forward. But I don't blame him anymore. I see him clearly now, a man who'd done his best in a system that made it almost impossible to do good, a man who'd loved his son more than he'd ever been able to show. And I realized that the thing I needed most wasn't his apology. It was my own acceptance. The investigation officially closed on a Tuesday. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. The people who'd spent decades building a system of corruption and quiet complicity have been exposed, prosecuted, and in some cases, imprisoned. The reforms were in place. The accountability measures were being tested. The machine was slowly, painfully being rebuilt. I read about it in the newspaper, sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee. The article mentioned me by name, called me a whistleblower and a hero. I'd stopped paying attention to that kind of language. It didn't matter what they called me. What mattered was that the truth had come out. And it had. The week after the investigation closed, I got a letter from the new department director. She was young, ambitious, and she'd been brought in specifically to clean up the mess. Her letter was formal, professional, and it contained a single request. MRDLI. The department is undergoing a complete restructuring. We've realized that many of our institutional failures were the result of losing institutional knowledge, the kind of knowledge you spent 28 years building. We'd like to invite you to return, not as a consultant, but as an advisor. We need your help to build a system that won't fail again. I read the letter 3 times. The department wanted me back. The department that had ignored me for 28 years, that had passed me over for promotions, that had treated me like a piece of furniture. They wanted my help. I sat there for a long time thinking about it, and then I wrote back. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored that you'd think of me, but I've moved on from the department. I'm building something new now, something that helps people who are still in the system, who haven't found their voice yet. If you want my help, I'm happy to advise, but I won't be coming back. I mailed the letter and didn't think about it again. The consulting firm I'd started grew into something I'd never expected. We didn't just fix problems, that we trained people to fix them themselves, that we created guides, manuals, systems that could be replicated anywhere. We worked with government agencies, nonprofits, and private companies, teaching them how to preserve institutional knowledge, how to avoid the mistakes we'd made. I'd spent 28 years being invisible. Now I was spending my time making sure no one else had to go through that. I still thought about my father. The letters he'd written, the ones I'd never received until after he was gone. I'd read them so many times that the pages were soft and worn, the creases deep from folding and unfolding. I kept them in a box on my nightstand. Sometimes, late at night, I'd pull one out and read it again. The one that meant the most to me was the shortest. It was written on a piece of scrap paper, the handwriting shaky and uneven. Son, I know I wasn't always there for you. I know I made mistakes, but I want you to know that you were the best part of my life. Everything I did for you, even when it didn't seem like it. I love you, Dad. I'd read that letter 100 times, and every time, I felt something shift inside me. He wasn't perfect. He'd made terrible choices, kept terrible secrets, failed me in ways I'd never fully forgive. But he'd loved me. And in the end, that was what mattered. A few months after the investigation closed, I was invited to speak at a conference on government reform. I didn't want to go. Public speaking had never been my thing, but the organizers were persistent, and eventually I agreed. I stood at the podium, looking out at a room full of bureaucrats, politicians, and reformers, and I told them the story I'd never told anyone. I spent 28 years being invisible, I said. 28 years doing work that no one noticed, asking questions that no one answered, watching the system fail over and over. And I stayed because I believed in the work, that I believed that what I did mattered, even if no one ever said thank you. I paused. The room was silent. But I was wrong about something, I said. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just kept my head down, the system would eventually recognize me, that IT didn't. The system doesn't recognize you unless you make it. The system doesn't reward you unless you demand it. And the system won't change unless you make it change. I could see some of them nodding. Others were shifting uncomfortably. I'm not telling you this to make you angry, I said. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand you have power, even when you feel powerless, even when you're invisible. You have power to speak up, to document, to hold people accountable, and if you don't use it, no one else will. The applause was loud, sustained, and it surprised me. I'd spent 28 years in that room, in rooms like it, invisible and forgotten, and now they were applauding me. I smiled, just a little. The final piece of closure came a year later. I was in my office, reviewing a new project, when my assistant buzzed to tell me I had a visitor. I went out to the lobby and found Susan, my father's old partner, waiting for me. "I have something for you," she said. "Something I found while going through your father's things." She handed me a small box. Inside was a ring, simple, gold, with an inscription on the inside. "For my son, who I hope will always know he was loved." I stared at the ring for a long time. "He wanted you to have it," Susan said. "He bought it years ago before he got sick. He never had the chance to give it to you." I slipped the ring onto my finger. It was the perfect fit. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for everything." She smiled and nodded. "He would have been proud of you. I know I am." I wore the ring every day after that. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't expensive, but it was his. And it reminded me that even in the darkest moments, even when I felt completely alone, I'd always been loved. A few weeks later, I went back to the department. Not as an employee, not as a consultant, but as a visitor. I walked through the halls I'd walked for 28 years, past the cubicles I'd worked in, past the offices of the people who'd ignored me. Everything had changed. The staff was younger, more diverse, more energetic. The systems were being rebuilt. The culture was shifting. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not in what I'd done, in what they were doing. They were carrying it forward, building something better on the foundation I'd helped lay. I walked to the corner where my cubicle had been, and I stood there for a minute. It felt smaller than I remembered, less important, a ghost of a place I'd once filled. But I was still here, and they were still here, and that was enough. I left the department that day without looking back. I didn't need to. The past was gone. The future was still being written, and I'd done my part. I'm 73 now. My consulting business is thriving that I've got 3 employees, a good reputation, and more work than I can handle. I've trained dozens of people, helped hundreds of clients, and made sure the lessons I learned won't be forgotten. I still think about the department sometimes. I think about the years I spent being invisible. I think about the people who ignored me, overlooked me, treated me like I didn't matter. But I don't feel angry anymore. I don't feel bitter. I feel something else entirely. Gratitude. Because without those 28 years, I wouldn't be who I am. I wouldn't have the knowledge, the experience, the understanding of what it takes to keep a system running. And I wouldn't have the ability to help others. I have a new generation of students now. Young people who come to me for advice, who ask me how to navigate the system, how to stay true to themselves without compromising their values. I tell them the same thing every time. Don't let anyone tell you you're invisible. You're not. You're the one who holds the whole thing together. And if they don't see that, it's their loss. I still have the ring my father gave me. I wear it every day. It reminds me of where I came from, of what I've been through, of the love that got me through the hardest parts. And it reminds me that I'm not invisible anymore. I never was.